Dust lay thick on the small frontier town, curling up with each step as if the ground itself carried secrets too heavy to be buried. Twilight bled across the horizon in bruised shades of purple and rust. On the wooden porch outside the saloon, a woman stood barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, her face shadowed so that only the trembling line of her mouth could be seen. Her lips shaped words she had whispered before and would whisper again. "Don't look at me." Her voice carried like the sigh of a ghost. Yet the townsfolk heard it all the same. Mothers pulled their children closer, men muttered under their breath, and shutters closed as if shame were contagious. She wrapped her arms around her middle, bruises hidden beneath frayed fabric. Her shoulders caved inward as though she wished the earth would swallow her whole. Across the street, Elias Boone reined in his horse. Dust clung to his boots, his trail coat heavy with the smell of long days' riding. He was a man who had seen loss, widower, rancher, a soul with weathered hands and eyes that had once held laughter, but now carried silence. He dismounted slowly, not to draw attention, but because the weight of what he saw made him pause. While the others turned away from the broken woman, he looked as though he carried her pain in his own chest. The woman, Clara May, caught his gaze and flinched. She shook her head and whispered again, sharper this time, "Don't look at me." She stepped off the porch and tried the general store, her shoulders bent low. But the shopkeeper glanced at her and muttered, "Not here." He turned the key, shutting her out with finality. Two children pointed, their giggles high and cruel, and their mother pulled them close as if Clara's shadow might taint them. Elias's hand tightened on the brim of his hat. He said nothing. He only watched, his chest heavy with the quiet injustice of it. Clara walked quickly down the dirt road, and no one followed but the stairs that clung like burrs. By nightfall, she found herself near the edge of town, in the old shed by the blacksmith's abandoned lot. There she curled into herself, knees to her chest, hunger gnawing like a wild animal. The wind pushed through cracks in the wood, sharp with desert chill. Her stomach growled, but she clenched her jaw. Pride was the only thing left to her, and even that felt fragile as glass. Later, when the night grew too dark for most men to wander, Elias came quietly. He left no words, only a bundle on the step, a heel of bread, some jerky, and a woolen shawl. He set it down and walked away, boots crunching softly in the dirt. Clara stared at the bundle as if it were a trap. Her body trembled, torn between hunger and dignity. For a long time, she resisted, biting her lip until it bled. Yet when the cold grew sharper and her ribs ached from emptiness, she reached out with shaking fingers. She tore off a piece of bread and pulled the shawl around her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, her body knew warmth that wasn't stolen. The next morning, the sun rose harsh and golden, cutting across the plains like a blade. Clara stepped outside, the shawl still around her shoulders. Elias stood a few paces away, his hands resting on the saddle horn of his horse. He did not speak, not until she looked up, startled by his nearness. He stepped closer, then did something no man in town had dared. He sank to one knee in the dust before her, lowering himself, not as a suitor, but as someone who would not let her brokenness stand above him like a wall. His voice was low, steady, carrying a weight she did not expect. "If you can't bear the eyes of others," he said, "then let mine be lowered. I'll meet you here, closer to the ground." She froze, torn between mistrust and the ache of being seen with gentleness. The shawl clutched in her hands felt suddenly heavier, like it carried his sincerity stitched into every thread. But the town was not blind. Gossip, like wildfire, spread before noon. "Boone's taken a liking to that ruined girl." Mabel Carter cackled in the tavern, her sharp tongue spilling poison into every ear. Men at the blacksmith sneered, muttering that Elias had lost his pride. The sheriff, Tully Briggs, said nothing, for silence was his way of keeping peace, though it only let the cruelty grow louder. Clara heard the whispers too. She felt them like stones hurled at her back. One evening she turned to Elias, her eyes flashing with both shame and sorrow. "Stop helping me," she said, her voice brutal. "I don't want your pity." But her voice trembled, as if some part of her longed to believe in the opposite, that this was not pity at all but something she could not yet name. That night she wandered to the riverbank, water glinting under moonlight, shawl wrapped tightly around her. The ripples mirrored her face, fractured, half-hidden. She whispered into the wind, softer than before, "Don't look at me." But this time her voice cracked, as if what she truly wanted, deep beneath the layers of shame, was for someone to keep looking anyway. Morning came slow over the plains, the kind of light that stretched thin, painting the earth in pale gold. Clara May stood on the edge of Elias Boone's ranch, the shawl still around her, though its threads now carried the faint smell of smoke and horses. Elias met her there, his eyes quiet, offering no judgment. Instead, he held out a simple choice. "There's work here, if you want it," he said. She almost turned away. Work meant obligation, meant being seen again. But hunger and need were stronger than pride, and so she followed him past the gate, into the hush of the ranch yard where hens scratched and cattle stirred. He gave her small tasks, watering, sweeping, tending the garden. She worked silently, shoulders stiff, never daring to lift her eyes when he passed. Elias never pressed. Instead, he left small offerings of grace, never announced. A repaired shoe by the door one morning, a cup of coffee waiting by the well, a quilt draped over the chair when the nights grew colder. She began to understand. He was speaking to her in a language beyond words. Days stretched into weeks. One afternoon, while feeding the hens, Clara found herself humming, a tune half broken, half remembered from girlhood. She did not notice Elias leaning against the fence post, listening with a stillness deeper than silence. When she turned and saw him, she flushed and fell quiet, but he only tipped his hat, as if her voice were something sacred. Trust, fragile as the first flower after frost, began to bloom. One day, Elias cut his hand on a strand of barbed wire. He tried to hide it, but Clara reached for his hand. Her touch trembled as she wrapped it in cloth, careful not to hurt him further. Elias did not speak, yet his breath stilled, and in that quiet moment, something passed between them, wordless but binding. The town, however, was not forgiving. Sheriff Tully Briggs pulled Elias aside one evening. "You'll ruin your name over her," he warned. Elias's answer was steady, unflinching. "A name means nothing if it leaves a soul starving." But gossip turned meaner, sharper. One night, Clara was caught outside town, the path dim and the moon veiled. A group of men, drunk on whiskey and whispers, surrounded her. Their laughter was cruel, their hands rough, their words tearing at what little she had left of herself. Then came the sound of hooves, the thud of boots on dirt. Elias was there, fury in his eyes, fists clenched. He didn't fight to destroy, but to shield, every strike measured like a wall raised against cruelty. The men staggered and fled into the dark, leaving dust and silence behind. Clara stood barefoot in the road, her breath ragged. She had braced for pain, but what she saw was Elias, bruised, bleeding, but steady, his body standing like a shield carved from something older than pride. Her eyes welled, her voice breaking as she whispered the words that had become her armor. "Don't look at me." But Elias did not rise above her. He fell to one knee again, battered though he was, his voice soft and unshaken. "I'll look at you only as you wish," he said, "but I'll never let you stand alone." Her hands trembled as they reached for his face, lifting his chin. For the first time, she did not hide. In the silver hush of moonlight, her shame cracked, giving way to something raw and tender. Wind stilled, the night held its breath, and in that fragile moment, the broken pieces of her spirit began to knit together again. Weeks later, she walked into town beside Elias, barefoot still, but by choice. Her head was no longer bowed. Whispers followed, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity, the shawl around her shoulders like a banner reclaimed. Elias walked at her side, silent, unbending, a steady shadow against the judgment of others. Years would pass, and still the old soul who tells this tale would remember. He would lower his voice at the fire's edge and say, "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't the pull of a trigger or the gallop of hooves. It's the lowering of one's gaze, so another can rise. Sometimes love isn't shouted in the streets. It's a loaf of bread left at a doorstep, or a man kneeling in the dust for a soul the world had cast aside. And if ever shame weighs heavy on your chest, remember this. Dignity can still rise, slow as dawn, but just as certain."